The ban did not erase the demand. It redirected it. And the document that recorded Micron's loss was written with no obligation to record where that loss went, which is precisely what makes it worth reading a second time. One filing, read against its own silences, draws the outline of a market transfer the text never names. The first reading follows the revenue line as Micron reported it. The second follows the gap that line creates and what the record declines to fill. Micron's disclosures addressing China segment revenue, filed in the period after the Cyberspace Administration of China, determined in May 2023 that Micron products posed national security risks, established the financial consequence with the precision a shareholder disclosure requires. China had represented a meaningful share of total sales in prior periods, running in the range of roughly a quarter of annual revenue across some reporting windows. Though the product composition of that figure varied, the filings address the affected exposure and the expected drag on forward guidance. They do so plainly. The revenue line is named, the segment is named, the regulatory instrument that triggered the loss is named. The filing identifies the impact as concentrated in dynamic random access memory and NAND flash supplied to domestic Chinese customers, particularly those classified as critical infrastructure operators under the Cyberspace Administration's guidance to cease procurement. The segment is named. The customers are not. That distinction is not unusual in earnings disclosures, and it is not being raised here as a deficiency. It is the first boundary the document draws around what it will account for. Forward guidance language in the disclosures uses phrasing consistent with managed uncertainty. The company describes efforts to offset the China revenue decline through other geographies and customer relationships. The word offset is doing careful work in that sentence. It implies substitution without specifying by whom, or to what degree, or whether the substitution is symmetric in terms of volume and specification. A company reporting its own mitigation efforts has no mechanism to report whether its former customers found an equivalent source. That is a different document entirely, and it was not the one filed. The filing states the financial consequence accurately. It does not state the commercial consequence. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between them is where the second reading begins. The Cyberspace Administration's determination and the subsequent procurement guidance to critical infrastructure operators is named in the filing, along with its effect on Micron's revenue. What the filing does not describe is what those operators did next. The document's obligation ends at Micron's own revenue line. It has no obligation to trace the dollar after it left Micron's column. That boundary is entirely proper as a disclosure matter. It is also where the most consequential information sits, and the filing does not cross it. A departure log at a port records every ship that left and what it carried. It does not record where the cargo went after unloading, or who received it at the next dock. Micron's filing is the departure log. It is complete and accurate on its own terms. The arrival record, if it exists in any form that can be reconciled to this one, is held by someone else and has not been filed in a form that closes the gap. The guidance language references geographic diversification and alternative customer channels as mitigation. What it does not reference, because it has no mechanism to reference it, is whether the Chinese customers who previously purchased Micron's memory products were simultaneously being served by a domestic alternative, or whether a domestic alternative was actively building the capacity to serve them at scale. Changxin Memory Technologies had been publicly reporting capacity expansions and yield improvements in double data rate 4 memory in the period surrounding the ban. That is an independent data point. It is not in Micron's filing, and that is not Micron's omission to own. The filing's silence on competitive substitution is unremarkable as disclosure practice. It becomes significant only when placed beside what the public record outside the filing suggests was occurring simultaneously in the domestic Chinese memory supply chain. The filing does not connect those two facts. The filing was not designed to. The filing's language on China exposure uses the category critical infrastructure operators as the class of buyers the Cyberspace Administration guidance addressed, without disaggregating what share of Micron's China revenue that class represented versus commercial buyers not covered by the procurement guidance. That granularity is absent from the document. The absence matters because it means the filing does not allow a reader to determine how much of the revenue lost was regulatory mandated and how much was voluntary commercial migration by buyers who were not formally required to switch but did so anyway. Those are meaningfully different market signals. Regulatory displacement and voluntary substitution point to different conclusions about the durability of Micron's position in that market. The document does not separate them. The several billion dollars in annual China revenue exposure Micron disclosed across its product lines is not, in the filing, an abstraction. It corresponds to the procurement budget of a set of large domestic Chinese buyers. Now reallocated within a supply chain, the filing does not trace and has no obligation to trace. Rendered at that scale, the silence in the document is not a small gap. It is the gap around which the rest of the filing is organized. The filing does not establish, and this reading cannot establish, that the revenue Micron lost was captured by any specific domestic Chinese producer. The link between Micron's disclosed loss and any particular domestic supplier's gain is reconstructed from independent public reporting and analyst estimates, not from the filing itself. An absent clause in a disclosure document is not evidence of the thing the clause does not mention. The filing does not settle whether Chinese critical infrastructure operators found a domestic substitute of equivalent specification, accepted a performance trade-off, drew down existing inventory, or sourced from alternative international suppliers not subject to the same regulatory pressure. All of those outcomes are consistent with the revenue figures the document reports, and the document does not adjudicate among them. Analyst estimates of domestic Chinese memory production capacity and yield in the relevant period vary materially. The filing has no obligation to resolve that variance, and this reading does not resolve it either. What the independent data suggests is a direction, not a measurement. The filing may also have been supplemented or qualified in subsequent disclosures, and later filings may close some of the gaps this one leaves open. What the record settles is narrower than what the record implies. Micron reported a loss. The filing does not report a transfer. The inference that a transfer occurred and that domestic Chinese memory production was a beneficiary is supported by independent reporting and sits in the margin of the document, not in its text. Taken together, the filing's disclosures describe a company that reported its exposure accurately, bounded its guidance honestly, and in the ordinary course of a shareholder disclosure, produced a document whose silences outline a market realignment the text was never designed to capture. The revenue line Micron reported missing does not appear on any other company's filing in a form that would allow a direct reconciliation. That is the record as it stands. One side of a ledger, filed correctly, read against the shape of what it does not contain. The document tells you what Micron lost. The silence is where the market went. The next filing worth reading closely is the one that gets filed from the other side of that transfer, if and when a domestic Chinese memory producer reaches the disclosure threshold that requires it to account for where its revenue came from. What would that document be required to say? And what would it have no obligation to mention? If you read documents the way this channel does, for what they establish and for what they decline to settle, subscribe, because the next filing is already in the record.